Are you questioning your reality? Do you feel gaslighted? It's not you. It's the media. I am Suchitra Vijayan and I'll be joined by Bhakti Sringarpure and Madhuri Shastri to eviscerate the propaganda, set the record straight and offer much needed moral clarity. Tune in each week. It's not you, it's the media, a podcast by the Polis Project.
Welcome to It's Not You, It's the Media. Our episode today is titled Worst Headlines in a Year of Livestreamed Genocide. Our podcast looks at the totalizing power of the media and ways in which we can cut through this urgent problem. So, what is so shocking about this past year? We have been seeing the genocide of Palestinians being live streamed. There continues to be an extraordinary amount of documentation of Palestinians by Palestinians themselves. Images, videos, clips, poems, essays, the whole gamut of self-representation is there for us to see, to hear, to understand. Yet mainstream liberal media staunchly refuses to report from this perspective. This is the most extreme version of gaslighting, and we've been living through this for an entire year. We see it, we hear it, and then we are told, no, you didn't see that. No, you didn't hear that. So this is a really big topic that we are tackling bit by bit for our entire podcast. But today, we are entering the second year of this live stream genocide. And we want to focus on the absolute worst, shameless, racist, horrifying, genocidal headlines that were rolled out in the past year. So why are headlines important? You may say that, oh, it's too shallow to focus on headlines. Not at all. Headlines have always been really key in shaping news coverage. Historically, we can even go back to the time of town criers or early advent of print. And the headlines are some of the most important examples of compressed, concise synopsis of the politics and the story itself. So over time, we can even observe grammar, syntax, sentence construction itself evolve through a history of headline. The point being that entire histories of language reside in headlines. And on a practical note, of course, we all crib about the fact that we live in an age of short attention spans, which are saturated with tweets and memes. And so in such a moment, headlines become even more important. So what we've done today is we've broken down these headlines into lots and lots of trends. And I'm just going to start us off with two of them. The first one that has been called out by critics and scholars ever since this horrifying year began and from before that, which is writing in a passive voice, which creates the impression that this is a weather report or there's a magical unfolding of events without anyone actually bombing someone, invading someone, killing someone. The second trend, and we have many more, we're just looking at these two for starters, it's to fake a both-sidism, a both-side style of reporting, which then casts doubt on things like death counts or international law violations through twists and stretches of language and by juxtaposing one type of image with a very different type of news story. Just the past day has been a sort of study in the worst of headline making. Suchitra, tell us what we've been living through for the past day.
I think what we've really seen is Iran finally retaliating back, and rightly so, against Israel's absolutely abhorrent military actions, the ground invasion of Lebanon. And I want to bring up the fact that I think over millions of Lebanese are now displaced. I think I want us to understand the numbers. Millions of Lebanese displaced from their own homes in the last 3 days of military action in Lebanon. And this comes from long history. This is the fourth time, I think, Israel is trying to invade and occupy Lebanon. And in response to the gruesome, almost violent military attacks that just leveled 3 blocks of Lebanese apartment buildings, Iran retaliates. And what Iran did was fire in 200 precision ballistic missiles. And I think it's very important for us to understand why that is the case, because unlike Israel, which claims to be the most moral army and yet causes immense civilian devastation, Iran specifically targets only military installations in Israel. All of these military installations are actually heavily populated civilian area, but there has been not a single Israeli civilian casualty. In response, you've also seen Israeli societies actually looking down upon Iran saying that, oh, you actually not killed our civilians. So again, what you're looking at international law is that targeted military attacks should be the norm. And even if there is a little excess of civilian deaths, the military attack should not go over, is what international law says. Of course, we know that Israel hasn't done that. Israel has made the entire Palestinian and Lebanese populations targets. Now, the real clown shit is not how Iran responded, but how Kamala Harris steps in and frames this. Kamala Harris says Iran is destabilizing the Middle East. After a year of consistently provoking not just Palestinians, not just Lebanese, not just Yemen, not just what's happening in Iran, finally you get a response, and Kamala Harris calls it that. The other thing you have to see is that the war crimes report, or the New York Times report, calls its headlines, it's at this point in time they are just spell making. It's like magic. Israel goes to retaliate after Iran's missile attack, again completely removing the fact that it's Israel which is the most destabilizing force, not to mention the immense environmental damage Israel has caused to the planet in the middle of an ongoing climate crisis that all of us are going to live through. And I'm sorry that at this point in time, I have no better word to describe this as except that it's clown shit. We are literally ruled by a bunch of clowns who just enjoy watching brown and black Muslim and Arabs getting slaughtered.
And the media that immediately mimics, cut, copy, paste, and says whatever, no historicity.
The stenographer, as you rightly said, the stenographer. Media now is the stenographer of the state.
Yeah, I mean, I even saw this in the sort of Washington Post reporting the entirety of the way that they reported on Israel's invasion of Lebanon. One thing that really stood out to me was how they said, just the idea of talking point, directly regurgitated. The Israeli military says that it was a limited attack and only 1,000 people have been killed or something like that. So to them, it's perfectly acceptable that 1,000 Lebanese dying in collateral damage because of an invasion is perfectly fine and it's limited. So that is the kind of thing that the Washington Post prides itself on regurgitating and on being a sort of presenter of the news, being a wartime reporting paper. But I also wanted to sort of pick up on what you were saying, go back a little bit, even though I can't even believe that this is just something that happened recently. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the headlines that we saw making the rounds when Israel invaded Lebanon. And before I get into it, I just want to say that this has been a very particularly difficult research piece for me. I think over the past year, specifically from January, every time I'd see a headline popping up, I would kind of look at it, feel a bit bad, then feel terrible, and then numb myself to whatever was happening, and then just dissociate to move on, dissociate. And just when I was researching for this episode, looking at every single headline in the past year laid out and the full gravity of the concerted effort of the media to further the annihilation and slaughter of the Palestinians and Arabs, Lebanese, brown people, Muslims, just the concerted effort of it was just incredibly painful. It was so difficult and painful for me to witness. And it's just absolutely disgusting. And this will lead us into our next point about passive voice headlines. But there was a particular headline that seems now that they are trying to paint in line with blaming Iran as the destabilizing force. The media is trying to take blame away from the US government's role in enabling this and kind of just perpetrating the genocide. There's a BBC headline that reads, quote, Biden struggles to contain conflict as Israel and Hezbollah on the brink.
Oh.
So first of all,
Dear Uncle Biden, you poor
I
thing,
know.
you're going to be okay, struggling to contain
I
only
know.
$9 billion worth of arms in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's so hard for you. They're painting him out to be some doddering old senile uncle, which he is, but he's a doddering old war criminal. And it's very obvious that Israel doesn't have the arms capacity to launch this kind of offensive in Lebanon. And clearly they have been armed to the teeth by the US, continuously funded and enabled. And they are only proceeding also because the US officials have given them a carte blanche. So it is absolutely insane to me that now the papers are like, oh, but Biden, he can't really do anything. It's just not possible. Secondly, I was also really bothered by the word conflict. Biden struggles to contain conflict, right? This is not conflict. This is an invasion. And there have been scores of memes doing the rounds about how every journalist has forgotten the word invasion when it comes to what happened, what Israel did in Lebanon. They sent ground troops. They did everything except invade. And what has preceded this invasion is actually a full blown genocide. It's not a conflict. It's not two people squabbling over chocolate or whatever. It is a genocide. And then there is the word contain. Biden struggles to contain the conflict. What is the word contain even doing there? Is it that, oh, the media and the US government had just sort of conspired to limit the genocide to Palestinians living in Palestine, and now it's spilling over, and so it has to be contained? Like, let's just go back there. Like, what is this? What are these words even doing? And to your point about headlines, this popped up on my phone, and it was very much the only thing I saw. So just like, had I not really been engaging, as I was unable to because of the painfulness of it, all of the last year, that's all I saw. And if I see this kind of very wishy-washy tone, oh, it's all passive voice, so Biden's really struggling and the conflict is just unable to be contained, it doesn't tell me that this is an attempt to decimate the Lebanese. There are 1,000 Lebanese have died, as I said, and it's simply limited and collateral. It's galling. That's all I have to say.
It is galling. It's shocking. It's just it's open season for racism and Islamophobia, of course.
And I think another thing that we really have to take into account is the ways in which we are kind of manufacturing a certain kind of consent to go after Iran. Not only does Kamala Harris start by setting the narrative by saying that it's Iran that is destabilizing the region, we already have op-eds from Bret Stephens, whose actually the actual title of the op-ed reads, actually, we absolutely do need to escalate in Iran. And this comes from a much larger history in which, for the last 20 years, Netanyahu and his associates and allies and stenographers and people who are on his, on his payroll, both in the US and Europe, especially in the US, have been pushing for a direct confrontation with Iran. And what you've really seen is that strategically, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it is Yemen, even in large parts of Syria, in Libya, the strategies on the ground for all of these countries, especially with Iran, is never to get into a full-blown war with the United States. And yet, what you see is the Iranian strategic calculation to not be drawn into a wider war being seen as the justification to constantly keep poking and escalate. And what you don't realize is that the people who will benefit from this is no one except Netanyahu, because America in the region going into a direct war with Iran would mean absolute annihilation for the rest of the world. And I think it's absolutely important for us to understand that Kamala Harris is starting the narrative, and you already have people like Bret Stephens very much on the right-wing Trump side saying this, and now next you'll find a liberal echoing the same thing. Just as the years after post 9/11, we saw headlines like, let's give war a chance. Actual headlines, let's give war a chance. We had literary giants like Salman Rushdie, again, convincing the public that this war was a moral war that was required. So it's same bottle, same wine, same PR, rinse, repeat, only the devastation that keeps blowing up.
Let's walk this back. So we started a bit with Iran, and now we're talking about the Lebanon invasion. How about the terrorist attack through the pagers that were applauded by the media, resounding applause for a terrorist attack? Brilliant, precise. Why were little children with pagers anyway? Of course, those little children are terrorists too. I mean, the brilliance, the sophistication, this was just so heartbreaking. And to know that the toll of those attacks was that it left those victims, for the most part, blinded and maimed. This is what we're applauding now? Little kids dying?
The point that you made about the pagers and the media is that I think they enjoy watching brown, black, Arab, Muslim, queer bodies killed. They enjoy this. So let's be very clear. Yes, the media is an extended arm of the state's propaganda. They are stenographers of an imperial ideology, but they also enjoy it.
I know that there's a long, long history for this, but as we are walking back through the year, as we are doing a sort of backward dance, I just had to bring up this idea of precision, sophistication, brilliance, technological marvels, all of these headlines that we have seen. And it's just I don't know what it is. And I know that there is a lot of coverage out there talking about the fact that the media is complicit in this genocide, that the media is not analyzing, the media is not breaking down. I want to do away with this pretension. The media is not complicit with genocide, it is actively propagating and promoting the genocide. It's propagating the slaughter and extermination. I'm going to say Muslims, absolutely 100% Palestinians, but never has a global wave of Islamophobia been this rampant and the hatred for Muslims been this unmasked and gory and open and permissible. And I think let's go back a little bit more. I mean, I think Suchitra, I remember some years ago you had a piece called Journalism as Genocide. I don't remember exactly what you were saying, but I remember being so shocked at this headline. I knew, of course, what you were talking about. I know the role of the media in propagating genocide historically. We are talking about the use of the radio in Rwanda, the use of various other media in the past, even when we're talking about Hitler's Holocaust. So I don't know, maybe tell us a little bit about this.
Journalism as Genocide was written at a very different time, and I think if I rewrote the piece now, which I think I should, it'll be a very different piece now. Journalism as Genocide is something that I had seen many years ago. There was a Rwandan anthropologist who did an anthropological study of hate, and then he kind of interviews people in the post in the aftermath of genocide. And the conclusion that he comes to is that when people are repeatedly exposed to a very specific kind of hate messaging, which leads to dehumanization, it's absolutely easy to convince people to kill. And he calls it journalism as genocide. And I think a little bit of context for people that don't know, I think the tribunals for Rwanda, where I worked on this case called the Simone Bikindi case, where for the first time, a pop singer was indicted for incitement of genocide. The point being that, of course, we all know about Radio Rwanda, but the idea that pop songs could also be. And I think what journalism as genocide as a concept that he kind of, the phrase comes from the judgment and Charles Mironko, the anthropologist's work. But I took that and kind of expanded the meaning and said that there is something else happening. Journalism as genocide is not just about instances of occupation. There is something larger happening. There is something called a democratic alibi where your governments are producing evidence, are producing ways for you to justify enjoying the violence against the people whose destruction you are bearing witness to. It takes an argument and makes it into a rhetoric. It's exactly what played out yesterday with JD Vance and Walls, right? It's like, oh, Haitian immigrants were so bad. And they're like, no, not all Haitian immigrants are undocumented. And he says, oh, by the way, I thought this was not unchecked. I thought you're not fact checking this conversation. Vance actually says this absolute impunity to perform lies as argument, this absolute impunity to make up reality, this absolute impunity to consistently justify violence and destruction of a whole people. And I think genocide is no longer an exception. I think all governments now have this system in place that is ready to go. It's like microdosing hate every single day. So one day it's ready to go. And I think that's where we really are. It's like, yeah, but it's okay. It's okay for us to kill a Palestinian child because this Palestinian child was legally killed, be legally murdered. Like, how do you legally kill a child is beyond me. But that's really where we are.
Absolutely. And first of all, congratulations for watching the Vance Walls.
Yes.
Wow, Suchitra. That's like a high level of tolerance from your end. I can't. But one of us should be watching. We should be vigilant. We should remain vigilant. So thanks for doing that for all of us.
Thank
And
you.
just because we are pointedly and again have decided to use the term genocide, let's just think about this word, right? Will you see this in mainstream media? Absolutely not. Did they report on the International Court of Justice presentation when they brought the genocide case against Israel? No. Do they want to use this word? No. because we only know one genocide, and we must remain within this idea that that's the only genocide that has ever happened in the history of the world. So that's one. And I wanted to connect the idea of the media's extreme violence, but a violence done with passive voice. How do you do violence with passive voice? I'm trying to remember the headlines. I noted down a few before that populated and were really shocking. One of them was lives ended in Gaza. Magically, lives ended in Gaza. First of all, it's a stretch for a verb. Nobody died because lives ended. You don't want to say killed. Forget about all that. So that was, of course, one of the very shocking ones that came on early in the day. Another one that the journalist Sana Saeed brought up in a talk she gave about this genocidal media. I remember finding it, and I remember there was all this analysis about it. Explosion, Gazans say, was airstrike, leaves many casualties in dense neighborhood. If I have a student who submits an
God.
essay with this sentence, what am I going to do? That's a strike. That is not a coherent sentence. Man, it packs a lot of punch. Man, it packs a lot of violence through this passivity, through this magical thinking. So I just wanted to put that back on the table, the ways in which violence can be conducted through this extraordinary passive tone. And these are, of course, New York Times headlines, BBC, Guardian, Washington Post, Atlantic. They are all responsible for churning out this new special grammar that they have invented to promote genocide.
Yeah, I mean, to promote genocide and just completely dehumanize the Palestinians, there is absolutely no object in that sentence. There's no who is this happening to. It casts so much doubt. It also just makes these war crimes look very murky. It's like explosions, Gazans say. So, first of all, let's just not trust the Gazans. It casts doubt on the veracity of the source, right? Like they're telling you that this is what the Gazans are saying, so maybe take it with a fistful of salt. It's just a very powerful way to simply remove the object from the sentence and have a total dehumanization. There's another one in this vein from the BBC, which says loud blasts heard in Beirut, and blast heard, comma, smoke seen in southwest Lebanon. What? Like, are you serious? First of all, I don't even know where to begin to dissect that, but it's just in the vein of exactly what you've been saying, Bhakti. This like completely casting a lot of doubt on the reporting, completely dehumanizing the Lebanese, making you question what this smoke could be. Maybe someone just having a bonfire. Maybe it's white phosphorus. Who knows? You know, we'll never know, and you will never know if you read the headline, and that's all people are reading.
Loud sounds and wafting smoke, Lebanese say, were around.
Turns out it was just a toaster burning.
You know, there's this cold, silent rage that's inside of everyone. My rage is that knowing that they enjoy annihilating people who look like us. They enjoy annihilating brown people, black people. They enjoy annihilating Muslims, Arabs. They enjoy this. Yesterday in class, we had this conversation, and a student was like, oh, what about colonialism? I said, colonialism is in the present. We are living, we are colonial bodies. Do you really think we are not colonial bodies? When the genocide started a year ago, I said, as a grandchild of a colonized person, I cannot not speak up for Palestine. And now I'm like, I'm a colonized body too. Colonization empire did not end. We are all colonized bodies. Yes, I might have an American citizenship, but we are colonized bodies. And that sense of rage that you have reduced me to a body that you can do away with at any point in time, whatever means you feel necessary. The lynching of a black man for a crime he did not commit. After 1 million people walked in, you killed him because you could.
Yeah.
You are killing us because you can, and you do it without impunity. And there is a photograph from 1892 of skulls of all the bisons that the colonizers in this country took. They went and killed the livestock that native communities here owned, because by destroying that, they destroyed their livelihood. A mountain of bison skulls killed and destroyed because they were annihilating native indigenous people by annihilating their land, annihilating the animals that they nourished and took care of. How is it any different now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, settler colonial and the logic of elimination, it's alive and well. And of course, what we've also seen this year are crazy op-eds that are saying, "Oh, settler colonialism is trendy." What is it? It's really it's untrue. It's a falsification. And these are in major newspapers instead of a media that kind of, or journalists or individuals even, radicalizing as they see something so extraordinary happening. We've had absolute zero examples. All we have are people falling in step with this sort of imperial racist propaganda, and it's really extraordinary. One of the things that I find to be interesting is the way in which places like New York Times and BBC play with a kind of both sidism. And this is a sort of complicated thought, but essentially it's very clear, of course, to us, and it's clear to anyone who follows this on a daily basis. There is no both sides, right? They only care about one side, which is the side of Israel and the side of the US and the side of Europe, but they still attempt this particular type of both sidism. So for example, if you see some of the big New York Times print spreads, you will see that there is a photo of rubble and Palestinian victims, and they are in there and they are clearly suffering. These are horrific images, but around that image are pure propaganda. Everything that the Israel PR and Israel army has been saying has been cut, copy, pasted. So, but when you see it, you feel like, oh, they really care about Palestinian suffering. There is a feeling like, oh, they're running these images, these horrific images, but we know that on social media or alternative media, we've been seeing way more gruesome stuff. We've seen way more extraordinary stuff, but they generate this idea, and this is a favorite mindset of a liberal, is that we care about both sides are suffering. And then over time, by faking this both sides narrative, what emerges is a picture that Palestinians are suffering because sadly it is Hamas and Hezbollah and quote terrorist organizations that are putting their bodies at risk. Because if you keep saying Israel is precisely targeting, is doing precision strikes, what do you have then? You have civilian deaths that are now being blamed on Palestinians themselves. So it's a very clever and really kind of Machiavellian, sly way of doing things, this way of juxtaposing things. I don't know if you've observed this, but I don't know
Yeah,
if you agree, actually.
I do. And I want to bring up this like, terrible human being called this French philosopher, Bernard Henry Levy. He's basically the OG Nepo baby. He's like a mediocre white man whose only role in this world is because his parents left him hundreds of millions of dollars. He says that Israel is liberating Lebanon. And again, the last I checked, it had 4 million views, and Zionists and Israelis and Americans and Europeans jumping in to say, yes, we are liberating. But more than that, what I want to talk about is how New Yorker framed this. So, New Yorker has a Palestinian contributor, Mossab Abu Toha. And Mossab is, of course, Rafat Al-Harir's student. He's a poet. He ran the Edward Said Library, a wonderful writer and a poet. And of course, he writes about New Yorker, the devastating moment in which he was picked up, held, tortured, and released. Of course, he writes about these ordeal. Of course, finally, they do it. And David Remnick does an interview with him. And the title is The Harrowing Detention in Gaza. This is not a detention. This was an illegal kidnapping and torture, a violation under international law. But if you read it as the harrowing detention in Gaza, you would think he had gone for a bloody walk and the Israelis had picked him up for jaywalking and then finally released him out. Like, yes, you're publishing a Palestinian. I'm not critiquing the Palestinian writer. Yes, you're publishing him. Yes, you're giving him a platform. He's gone through an ordeal that most people can barely survive. He's come and he's left and he's writing about it. But for David Remnick, a man who justified the invasion of Iraq, justified the war in Afghanistan, to then do this, oh, I'm the editor in chief and I will have a conversation with you. And then the title literally reads The Harrowing Detention. And you're defanging his politics. This was Rafat Al-Harir's student. This is a man who's written beautifully about what it means to live in Gaza, what it means to survive in Gaza, what it means to thrive and live a life despite the Israeli occupation. And you take him and you take his ordeal and his trauma, you publish it, you get that brownie point. So now people can say, yeah, it's like New York Times would justify the annihilation of Afghans and Iraqis during the war on terror, but then send Anand Gopal to do an in depth research and reported piece on drone casualties. And all of a sudden, we should now applaud for just rolling out the carpet for the imperial invasion to take place. Again, this is not a critique of Anand Gopal. Anand Gopal is a phenomenal journalist, and I think he did great reporting. But the reporting on drones does not exist in a vacuum. Reporting on Iraq, Syria, Libya, Kashmir, any occupied part of the world does not exist in vacuum. You create and justify and enable the violence, and then you do that one piece that says, look how bad the violence is, but never once mentioning who was responsible for it. This is the greatest trick in the world.
I'm going to talk a little bit here about my personal experience when I was the publisher of Guernica on this sort of both sides point. This piece was published, no one had really consented to it, but it was by this Israeli Zionist writer called From the Edges of a Broken World. Basically, it's a personal essay, and it is basically entirely the themes, Bhakti and Suchitra, that you were talking about. Like, oh my God, it is so bad for the Palestinians, but it is also so bad for the Israelis because of Hamas. And this writer, she's writing about how she is just the milk of human kindness is flowing through her, and she's ferrying Palestinian children to and from the hospital, and she's just so devastated by having to do this. And it's all like, never is it mentioned why she is taking these children to the hospital. And the whole thing, in the whole essay, this just, I mean, I called it hand wringing, but it is hand wringing. It is so miserably devastating, and I, an Israeli, cannot bear it, and I'm forced to do this kind of thing. And not in one sentence has she attributed any blame or created any context as to why this child is in the hospital, why this is happening. And yet all she wants is for us to have this incredible empathy for these very kind Israelis who don't want to see Palestinians suffer. And so they're doing everything they can to help. But stop it, Palestinians. And this essay caused a big stir in the publishing world and in the literary world. And it was some very brave editors who resigned. There were mass resignation, and the magazine has since imploded. I resigned too. And the media really picked up on it. It was a feeding frenzy for all of the liberal media for the shuttering of this so-called progressive magazine, Guernica, over 20 years. It's been around for 20 years. And every single one of these magazines painted these editors who had quit as hand-wringing progressive babies who could not countenance the idea of empathy with Israel. So aside from this, like, anti-Semitism allegations and whatnot, there was really this idea that all pro-Palestinian progressives are unable to see the other side, and they are just unable. They are so unreasonable. And they keep on saying, oh, Palestinians, they simply cannot even countenance the idea of empathy with Israel. And this was said in op-eds in the New York Times, LA Times, The Nation. Everyone, both sides did this to another degree. And then I recently read in the New York Review of Books, there's a very good article. It's a very difficult read about torture in Israel's prisons. And there is a Pew survey quoted here that says, a Pew survey found that 39% of Israelis thought that the military response to Hamas was about right. 34% said it had not gone far enough. Only 19% thought it had gone too far. Most of those who thought it had gone too far were Palestinian Israelis. Only 4% of Jewish Israelis thought it had gone too far. This is your other side. This is the other side. This is the both sides. This is the other side that they are saying we do not have empathy with, and therefore they should completely disregard us as kids who have thrown our toys out of the pram. This is the other side.
Wow. I didn't know those numbers. Of course, I would have guessed, but there's a part of me that wishes it wasn't such an absolute open season. I mean, for extermination of Palestinians. As we know, there were protests, of course, in parts of Israel. And those protests really were focused on the hostages and bring the hostages back. And sure, you're allowed to mourn those tragedies and so on and so forth. But at no point was it stop the war, stop the extermination. And of course, the media did not report on those protests at all, because you never report on protests. That's just unruly, strange riots that nobody wants to deal with. And at that point it became clear to me that there isn't really an opposition for this war. Another function of these worst headlines, of a history of having a media that has such a deep dependency and servility towards their governments, towards their imperial racist governments, is the extent to which the media goes out of their way to normalize racist language, to normalize a kind of hatred for Muslims, othering, creating a sort of us versus them mentality. And of course, for me, just given my age, my coming of age and really understanding this was after 9/11, where I actually could not believe some of the things that we were reading. And then all this kind of language we came up with around terrorism, terrorists, Muslims, so on and so forth. But even before that, growing up in India and seeing the headlines about Kashmir, seeing just the sort of hatred being drummed up towards Muslims, there is a role that the media plays in validating racist stereotypes, in validating and normalizing what we may see or think about non-white peoples, rather than do the opposite. So I don't know. I think this has been an incredible year to have unmasked some of this racism. It's just out there, it's open.
I hate the phrase Islamophobia, because it is not Islamophobia. It is just hatred of Muslims. It's anti-Muslims at its base level, right? And women have always been used as a pawn in this empire game, in this way to frame Arab men or Muslim men as barbarian, to create this caricature. We spoke about this in our last episode with Gettleman. I today saw a Instagram picture of Meryl Streep, who addressed some UN council or whatever, saying a bird can sing in Kabul, but a woman cannot. So there are these ideas of, they are so held back, Muslim women, they are so held back by their horrendous men. And then that feeds this idea that the liberated American woman must necessarily be hated for nothing except her liberation, whatever this cute idea of liberation is. So using the idea of this repressed Muslim woman, just overbearing Muslim man as a trope, I mean, this trope lives on in 2024, and people are really applauding, and they still feel so bad. I mean, it's in every TV show. If you thought Homeland was like, oh, passe, and we've moved past, we've come to some more understanding of Muslims or whatever it is. No, like every TV show, every piece of pop culture paints Muslims in this way. It has normalized the stereotype. It has happened in India with this whole idea of love jihad. Oh, they are coming for our Hindu women and they are converting them, and which is which is why India stood with Netanyahu when everybody left the UNGA meeting. Anti-Muslim sentiment is simply accepted. Whether it was George Bush fabricating the lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in order to invade Iraq, even though it's all come out and we know that he fabricated it, the narrative that Muslims are terrorists, that they are barbarians, that they are backward. I don't know if you remember that horrendous book, Not Without My Daughter, or whatever that awful book was.
It became a movie too, so that was
exactly helpful. And every other show that has followed that paints Muslims in this way, oh, they pray 5 days, 5 times a day, will you be able to, like this extremely primitive race, those narratives live.
Yes, and as you know, all of this Islamophobia or anti-Muslimness, the entire thing we discussed last week, the mass rape hoax, is completely predicated on the idea that even though we have no evidence that any of these events occurred, it must be true because the Muslim male is a savage male, and wink wink, this is understood that this happened. And everyone fell for it. Of course, they all fell for it. We can call it screams without words, or we can call it journalism without ethics, or articles without evidence. I mean, this is just preposterous. And it's all about the racism that gets fabricated. And one of the things that I think again and again is, oh, we have to do away with ignorance. We have to teach people. We have to teach them about other cultures, other people. We have to teach them history. It is never about teaching anyone anything. It's never about learning new information. The whole task ahead of us is the unlearning. unlearning, unlearning, and more unlearning, because everybody comes preset with these ideas. And every day we go, we look at the news, we look at articles, we read books, we watch TV, and those ideas are regurgitated, mirrored, echoed over and over again. And this is the cancer of racism, right? We can't dismantle it by teaching people something new or humanizing somebody. It's just that we have this backlog of sludge of racism that has been learned and keeps being taught every day by the media.
I think tragically, everything that you said about you don't need to have journalistic ethics at all when you're saying this is because for the media, it's like, oh, we told you Muslim men were like this. We've been saying it. You were the ones that were trying to paper over it, but we've been saying this. And I don't know where to go with the unlearning, because I think when Americans conceive of race, in my opinion, to them, it is just binary. It's black, and then there is the mirror image, white. And I don't know if Americans have in their capacity this idea to conceive of race in a way that allows for a true anti-racist unlearning. This is not to say that there is no anti-blackness among South Asians. There is. This is not to say that the legacy of slavery doesn't exist. Nothing. It is horrendous. But it is simply to say that the overcorrection that white American society has done in its unlearning and anti-racist training is so far in one direction that it completely obscures the fact that there are other people that are really discriminated on and othered and reviled on the basis of race as well.
All this anti-racist stuff that we've seen in the past few years, it has embedded the idea of things like white fragility and what is anti-blackness and things like that. But there's a whole missing spectrum here. Though I will say, to bring back our conversation to the media, what kind of reporting did we see for the movement for Black Lives? What kind of reporting have we seen every time a Black young person or an old person or whatever is shot by the police? There is some general hopelessness and an overarching racism that we are unable to fix, that is just so embedded. And to come back to the term that we're using, worst headlines in a year of live stream genocide, as we have decided to call this episode, let's think about just the amount of ways in which you have gone on and on with the language of what we can say whitewashing or erasure or omission, to move as far away to not deal with the mechanics of what is a genocide. There is a wonderful scholar named Asal Rad on Twitter, and she's dedicated to redlining headlines from various mainstream media, and then she corrects them. And it's really helpful, actually, because it always points out what's exactly wrong. They never name the perpetrator. Everything is passive voice. Everything is magical. And she had this tweet recently, and I'm just going to read it out, where she said, here is the language of whitewashing. So, for example, she says, Israel invades Lebanon. What does the media say? Israel sends troops on a little errand somewhere.
A little picnic.
A little picnic. Israel blocks aid. What does the media write? Hunger stalks Gaza. And again, by the way, the media has covered up the extent to which Israel has blocked humanitarian aid, food, destroyed water supplies. And they use this. I mean, I'm sure the headlines sing they're making poetry. Hunger stalks Gaza. Wow, what a beautiful phrase, applause. And here's the last one by Asal Raj. She says, Israel flattens apartment buildings. As we know, what does the media call it? A targeted strike. I mean, just for her to lay it out like that tells us the extraordinary trickery and mind games that have been going on for the past year. Anything to avoid saying starvation, blocking aid, invasion, slaughter, killings. And the thing that absolutely bothers me to no end is that they try to cast doubt on the death counts again and again. Counting the dead in Palestine is a heroic task, is an impossible task. At this point, counting the dead is close to impossible because the disappeared under the rubble are extraordinary. Entire children are orphaned, so you can't document. People are slaughtered to an extent you can't see who it is. How do you identify?
And the disappearing bodies, now they have a new kind of a bomb that evaporates bodies. At one point in time, I would use this sentence called dead bodies are no longer proof of death. This happened during COVID, where everybody said that, especially in India, a dead body in front of you was not proof of death. And I kind of saw that repeat itself. Yes, a dead body, a list is no longer a proof of death, but on one side, they're running out of soil to bury the dead in Gaza. At the same time, in the last year, innovation has gotten to a point where now bodies are disappearing. There are no dead bodies. Imagine the violence of just
Absolutely.
it's
Absolutely. And what is to gain? I mean, as far as I know, journalists' salaries were never enough to justify this much inhumanity. So I actually have no idea what is being gained by this level of gaslighting. Is it just a pure desire, a pure bloodthirst? There are days when I feel, whatever, this is business as usual for these media. But there are days when I'm in absolute shock and I don't understand what place are we in. I mean, what is this sympathy? What is this extraordinary allegiance? It is really special, and I know that there are intellectuals who have worked through it and so on, but I just want to allow myself to be utterly shocked by this. What is going on?
A very harrowing realization that I've had, again, something that I feel I've known intellectually for a while but haven't engaged with emotionally, is that genocide is the end goal of the empire. It is not some sort of consequence, it's not collateral damage, it is the aim. So whether the state is killing you by blowing you up to smithereens, whether they are evaporating your body, whether they are killing you, lynching you for a crime you did not commit, whether they are leaving you to die in prisons and through utter neglect, dying of debt, dying of climate crisis, they are watching you die. They're killing you. They just don't care enough to come and save you. One way or another, they are killing you. And that is the aim. All of these journalists, yes, the pay grade doesn't justify the lies they peddle and their shilling for the empire. It cannot be the pay grade. It must be that they genuinely believe. I don't want to say in democracy or the state or whatever, because it is literally 2024. I do think that they believe entirely in the dehumanization of non-white and poor people. They do not care about you. They want you to die, and so they will go out and kill you by any means possible. And all we have to do is sit and watch the state kill and kill and kill and kill and kill.
And the
This,
media justify and justify and justify that killing.
they are cut from the
It's
same cloth.
extraordinary. Cut from
They
the
are
same
cut from the
cloth.
same cloth.
I think this past year has been visceral and cathartic at the same time. It's visceral because so many of those inclinations that we knew were real. So many of those things that were always just beneath the surface, you realize is not. There is an institutionalized system that consistently works to dehumanize us, that consistently works to deprive us of our capacity to exist. But really, just so many of us who believe in the power of the written and spoken word. I am constantly just struggling with the failure of words, failure of language. And then today we spoke about New York Times and genocide media manufacturing a new kind of grammar. They are able to deal with language fine. Language works for them. And it's us who don't know. They have emptied us out of our language, of our empathy, of our humanity, and this idea of bearing witness, of moral witnessing. And this is something that I've also spoken with Madhuri, is that bearing witness to violence for a year has taught me to expect violence against me. A recent incident that a lot of you, both of you know happened, I don't want to go into it. When it happened against me, my first response was not anger. I disassociated. I was like, I was expecting this violence against me. I know this was going to happen. I just don't know how I'm going to come back from it. And I think that is true for so many people. And for me, this is an extension of what happened right from 9/11. It's been 24 years now. And this is really where we are. Loss of us as moral beings, loss of us as our value of moral witnessing, and just feeling so deeply depleted. And for those of you who believe you're going mad, it's not you, it's the media.